4,000 autopsies, but this one changed everything. Adrienne Holt's body looked like suicide until she found multiple strangulation marks beneath the surface. Then the walls started tapping. Whispers filled the darkness. Who orchestrated this perfect death? She had done over 4,000 autopsies, but this one changed everything. Dr. Evelyn Hartwell thought she had seen it all. But when Adrienne Holt's body came to her table, the clues told a very different story. What looked like just another suicide case quickly turned into something much darker and maybe impossible to explain. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Leave a like on the video and comment below where you're listening from. Now take a deep breath, relax, and stay with us until the end, because the truth hides in the details. I have been a forensic pathologist for 19 years, working at the Cook County Medical Examiner's Office in Chicago. In that time, I have done over 4,000 autopsies, looking at everything from natural deaths to the worst murders the city has seen. I thought I had seen every way a person could die. I was wrong. My name is Dr. Evelyn Hartwell, and what I am about to tell you happened on a Thursday evening in November during what should have been a routine check of what looked like a suicide. The case was about Adrienne Holt, a 31-year-old accountant from Lincoln Park, who had been found dead in his apartment by his landlord after neighbors complained about a bad smell. The police report said Holt had been found in his bathroom, having hanged himself with a belt from the shower rod. Everything seemed pretty clear. Holt had been going through a hard divorce, had just lost his job at a downtown accounting firm, and had a history of depression. He had been taking medicine for it. His ex-wife said he had been very sad in recent weeks, and his therapist said he had missed his last 3 appointments. Everything pointed to a sad but common ending. The body came to our building on Thursday morning, but because we had many cases from a violent weekend, I couldn't start the examination until almost 7 o'clock p.m. The building was mostly empty by then, with only the night security guard and me left. I like working during these quiet hours when I can. Without distractions, I can focus completely on the careful work that forensic pathology requires. I started with the standard outside examination, taking pictures of the body from different angles and writing down the signs of suffocation. The mark around Holt's neck looked right for hanging, showing the upside-down V pattern that meant the knot had been at the back of his neck. There was some face swelling and small burst blood vessels in the eyes. Both normal things you see when someone dies from not being able to breathe. What seemed strange, though, was the condition of Holt's hands. In hanging cases, it's normal to see defensive injuries, scratches, or scrapes where the person naturally clawed at whatever was around their neck in their final moments. Holt's hands showed no such marks. His fingernails were clean and unbroken, with no skin or fibers under them. For someone who supposedly fought against a belt around his neck, his hands were surprisingly perfect. I wrote this down and kept going with the examination. The autopsy room had our standard recording system, and I turned it on at 7:23 p.m. As I started the internal examination, the bright lights hummed with their familiar electric buzz, and the air system kept its steady flow. Everything was routine, methodical, exactly as it should be. I made the standard Y cut and started looking at Holt's internal organs. His heart showed no signs of disease. His lungs were clear and his liver looked normal for a man his age. But as I worked, I started to notice small details that didn't quite fit with a simple suicide story. Holt's stomach contents showed that he had eaten a full meal within 2 to 3 hours of his death. This is unusual for someone planning to kill themselves. The meal looked like takeout Chinese food, and there was no sign of alcohol or drugs in his system, except for the prescribed antidepressants, which were at normal levels. Most people thinking about suicide either don't eat at all or drink alcohol or take drugs to ease their mental pain. Even more puzzling was his clothing. Holt had been found wearing a clean white dress shirt, pressed pants, and shined shoes, not the casual clothes you might expect from someone spending their final day at home. His clothes showed no signs of struggle, no wrinkles or tears that might show he had been held down or fought against an attacker. I was looking at Holt's neck more closely when I noticed something that made me stop. The mark from hanging, while looking right for hanging, showed an unusual pattern. Most hanging victims who use a belt create a mark that changes in depth and width as the belt's texture presses into the skin. Holt's mark was remarkably even, as if the pressure had been applied evenly all the way around his neck. I took pictures of the mark from different angles and measured it. The depth was the same all the way around, something I had never seen in a hanging case. It was possible that the belt had been positioned perfectly and that Holt's weight had spread the pressure evenly, but it seemed unlikely. As I continued the examination, I became aware of a small change in the feel of the autopsy room. The temperature seemed to have dropped a little, though the digital thermometer still read 68 degrees. The air felt heavier somehow, more pressing, as if a storm were coming. I checked the weather on my phone, but clear skies were predicted for the evening. I was removing Holt's brain for examination when I heard the first sound that shouldn't have been there. It was faint, barely heard above the hum of the air system, a soft tapping, rhythmic and on purpose. I stopped my work and listened carefully, but the sound had stopped. I went back to the examination, carefully cutting Holt's brain to look for signs of injury or disease. The tissue looked normal with no signs of bleeding, swelling, or other problems that might explain his death. But as I worked, the tapping sound came back more clear this time. It seemed to be coming from somewhere within the walls of the autopsy room, a steady rhythm that reminded me of Morse code. I tried to ignore the sound and focus on my work, but it was becoming harder to concentrate. The tapping would start and stop at different times, sometimes lasting for several minutes, sometimes just a few seconds. There was no pattern I could figure out, no obvious source I could find. I was looking at Holt's hands more closely under magnification when I made another disturbing discovery. While his fingernails showed no signs of defensive injuries, there were tiny puncture marks on his fingertips. 8 small wounds, 4 on each hand, positioned exactly where fingernails would have pressed into the skin if his hands had been squeezed into tight fists. The wounds were barely visible to the naked eye, but under the microscope they were clearly there. They appeared to be self-inflicted, as if Holt had dug his nails into his own palms with tremendous force. But there were no matching marks on his palms, no proof that his nails had actually gone through the skin there. I documented these findings with pictures and detailed notes, though I wasn't sure what to make of them. The puncture marks suggested that Holt had felt extreme stress or pain in his final moments. But their location and pattern didn't match any scenario I could think of from the physical evidence. The tapping sound had changed into something more complex, not just a simple rhythm, but what sounded almost like a conversation. 2 different patterns seemed to be responding to each other. One coming from the wall behind the examination table, the other from somewhere near the ceiling. I found myself listening to these sounds instead of focusing on my work, trying to decode some meaning from their interaction. At 9:15 p.m., I made a discovery that changed my entire understanding of the case. While looking at Holt's neck tissue under the microscope, I found evidence of multiple marks from hanging, not just the obvious one visible on the surface, but several fainter impressions beneath it. The tissue showed signs of repeated trauma, as if something had been applied and removed multiple times before the final fatal application. This finding didn't match suicide. Someone who hangs themselves doesn't typically practice the act multiple times. The pattern suggested that Holt had been subjected to repeated episodes of strangulation, possibly as a form of torture before the final hanging that killed him. I immediately called Detective Vincent Dorsey, the investigating officer on the case, to report my findings. Dorsey was an experienced detective with 23 years on the force, someone I had worked with on dozens of cases. He listened to my early report without interruption, then asked several pointed questions about the evidence. "Are you saying this wasn't a suicide?" Dorsey asked. I'm saying the physical evidence doesn't support that conclusion, I replied. The multiple marks, the absence of defensive injuries, the condition of his clothing. None of it fits the typical pattern of a hanging suicide. Dorsey was quiet for a moment. The scene was clean, Doc. No signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry. If someone killed this guy, they were very careful about it. That's what concerns me, I said. This looks like the work of someone with knowledge of forensic investigation, someone who knew how to stage a scene to look like suicide. Dorsey agreed to reopen the investigation and promised to have the crime scene team take another look at Holt's apartment. But as I hung up the phone, I realized that my examination was far from over. The physical evidence was telling a story that didn't match the official story, and I needed to document every detail if we were going to build a case for murder. I returned to the examination table and continued my work, but the atmosphere in the autopsy room had become increasingly heavy. The temperature seemed to continue dropping, though the thermometer still read normal. The tapping sounds had become more frequent and more complex, and I found myself looking around the room, half expecting to see someone else there. I was looking at Holt's fingernails more closely when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Stuck beneath the nail of his right index finger was a tiny piece of what appeared to be human skin. It was barely visible, just a microscopic flake, but it was definitely organic tissue. I carefully took out the piece and prepared it for microscopic examination. Under high magnification, I could see that it was indeed human skin, but it showed characteristics that didn't match Holt's own tissue. The cell structure was different, suggesting it had come from someone else. This was the first concrete evidence that Holt had been in physical contact with another person shortly before his death. If he had scratched his attacker, even slightly, it might provide DNA evidence that could identify his killer. I collected the tissue piece and several other samples for DNA analysis, though I knew the results wouldn't be available for several days. But the discovery had given me new energy to continue the examination to look for other evidence that might have been overlooked. I was taking pictures of the tissue piece when the lights in the autopsy room flickered. It was just a momentary interruption, barely noticeable, but it was followed by a change in the sound of the air system. The steady hum became irregular, almost labored, as if the system were struggling to maintain proper airflow. I checked the environmental controls, but everything appeared to be working normally. The temperature was stable, the air pressure was within normal limits, and the filtration system showed no error codes. Yet something had definitely changed in the atmosphere of the room. I continued my examination, focusing on Holt's internal organs for any additional evidence of trauma. His heart showed no signs of disease or injury, but there was something unusual about the blood pooling patterns. In a typical hanging, blood settles in the lower portions of the body due to gravity, creating characteristic patterns. Holt's blood pooling was inconsistent with the position he had supposedly been found in. The pattern suggested that his body had been moved after death, repositioned to create the appearance of a hanging. This was further evidence that we were dealing with a murder staged to look like suicide. I was documenting these findings when I heard a new sound. Not the rhythmic tapping I had been hearing throughout the evening, but something that sounded almost like whispering. It was so faint that I couldn't be sure I was actually hearing it, but it seemed to be coming from somewhere very close to the examination table. I stopped all movement and listened carefully. The sound was definitely there. A soft conversation that rose and fell like breathing or quiet talk. But there was no one else in the autopsy room, and the sound didn't seem to be coming from the air system or any other mechanical source. I tried to dismiss it as hearing things brought on by tiredness and stress, but the whispering continued, becoming gradually more distinct. I couldn't make out words, but there was definitely a pattern to the sounds, a rhythm that suggested language or communication. I decided to complete the examination as quickly as possible and get out of the building. The buildup of strange things, the temperature changes, the tapping sounds, the flickering lights. And now the whispering had left me genuinely unsettled, though none of these things had obvious explanations. As I completed my examination and prepared to leave the autopsy room, The whispering sounds seemed to get stronger. They were coming from multiple directions now, as if several people were having quiet conversations just outside my range of hearing. But every time I tried to focus on the sounds, they would fade away, leaving only the familiar hum of the air system. I finished my documentation at 11:47 p.m. and sealed Holt's body for storage pending the completion of the investigation. As I gathered my notes and prepared to leave, I took one last look around the autopsy room. Everything appeared normal. The examination table was clean, the instruments were properly stored, the environmental systems were working correctly. The atmosphere in the room still felt wrong, heavy in a way that I couldn't explain. It was as if the space itself had been contaminated by whatever had happened to Adrian Holt, as if the violence of his death had left some kind of residue that couldn't be cleaned away with disinfectant and bleach. I left the building quickly, eager to get home and try to process what I had discovered, but as I walked to my car in the parking garage, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. Every sound made me jump. I drove home through the empty streets of Chicago, constantly checking my rearview mirror for signs of pursuit. The rational part of my mind knew that I was probably overreacting, that the stress of the unusual case and the strange things in the autopsy room had made me paranoid. But the disturbing evidence I had uncovered kept echoing in my thoughts. The multiple marks, the staged scene, the tissue piece under Holt's fingernail. Over the following days, Detective Dorsey's investigation uncovered disturbing connections between Holt's death and several other recent suicides in the Chicago area. 3 other men, all in their 30s, all going through personal or professional difficulties, had died by hanging in the past 6 months. In each case, the deaths had been quickly ruled suicides based on the apparent circumstances and the victims' documented mental health struggles. But when Dorsey and his team re-examined these cases with fresh eyes, they found subtle inconsistencies similar to those I had discovered in Holt's autopsy. Clean fingernails where defensive injuries should have been present, unusual blood pooling patterns, clothing that was too neat for someone who had supposedly struggled against something around their neck. The DNA analysis of the tissue piece I had found under Holt's fingernail came back with a match to a man named Gabriel Rohr, a 42-year-old former military contractor with a history of violence and a connection to several unsolved murders in other states. Rohr had been in Chicago during the time period when all 4 men had died, and further investigation revealed that he had been hired by someone to eliminate these specific targets. But Rohr himself was found dead in a motel room on the south side of Chicago before he could be arrested. He had apparently overdosed on heroin, though he had no history of drug use, and the circumstances of his death were as suspicious as those of his victims. The investigation eventually revealed that all 4 men had been involved in a financial fraud scheme that had cost their employer, a major investment firm, millions of dollars. Someone had decided that the legal system wasn't moving fast enough to punish them and had hired Rohr to eliminate them one by one, making their deaths look like suicides brought on by guilt and shame. The mastermind behind the killings was never identified. The investigation traced the payments to Rohr through a series of shell companies and offshore accounts, but the trail went cold before reaching the actual source. Whoever had ordered the deaths had covered their tracks with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized the murders themselves. The case was officially closed as a series of murders committed by Gabriel Rohr, who had subsequently died of an apparent drug overdose. But I knew that the real killer was still out there. Someone with the resources and connections to plan such an elaborate scheme and then disappear without a trace. What disturbed me most about the case wasn't just the calculated nature of the murders, but the realization of how easily they might have gone undetected. If I hadn't noticed the subtle inconsistencies in Holt's autopsy, if I hadn't been thorough enough in my examination, these deaths would have remained classified as suicides. The real killer would have achieved their goal of eliminating the fraud conspirators while avoiding any legal consequences. The experience changed how I approach every case that comes through our facility. I pay closer attention to details that might seem unimportant. Look more carefully for evidence that doesn't fit the obvious story. I've discovered 3 other cases in the past year where deaths initially ruled as suicides showed signs of being staged murders, though none as elaborate or well-planned as the Holt case. But what haunts me most about that night in the autopsy room aren't the forensic discoveries or the criminal investigation that followed. It's the memory of those sounds, the tapping, the whispering, the sense of being watched by unseen eyes. I've worked hundreds of cases since then, spent countless hours alone in that same autopsy room, but I've never experienced anything like what happened during Holt's examination. I've tried to rationalize those things as stress-induced hallucinations, as the product of tiredness and the unsettling nature of the case. But deep down, I can't shake the feeling that something else was present in that room that night. Something that wanted Holt's story to be told, his murder to be discovered and investigated. Maybe it was just my subconscious mind picking up on subtle clues that my conscious awareness hadn't yet processed, manifesting as auditory and sensory hallucinations that guided me toward the evidence I needed to find. Or maybe there really was something supernatural about that night, some kind of presence that refused to let an injustice go unnoticed. I don't know which explanation I find more disturbing. What I do know is that Adrienne Holt's case taught me that the most terrifying autopsies aren't necessarily those involving the most violent or gruesome deaths. Sometimes the most frightening cases are the ones that look routine on the surface, but hide carefully constructed lies beneath. The ones where someone has gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal the truth, to make murder look like something else entirely. Those are the cases that remind me that evil isn't always obvious or dramatic. Sometimes it's methodical, patient, and intelligent. Sometimes it wears a mask of respectability and operates from the shadows, eliminating its enemies with surgical precision and leaving barely a trace of its presence. And sometimes, if you're very careful and very thorough, you can catch just a glimpse of that evil before it disappears back into the darkness where it came from. The case remains a reminder that in forensic pathology, as in life, things are not always what they appear to be. The most important discoveries often come from paying attention to the details that don't quite fit, the small inconsistencies that suggest a larger truth hidden beneath the surface. And sometimes late at night when I'm working alone in the autopsy room, I still hear those sounds, the tapping, the whispering, the sense of invisible presences moving through the shadows. I tell myself they're just echoes of that one disturbing case and memories triggered by the familiar environment and the solitary nature of my work. But part of me wonders if there's something more. Part of me wonders if the dead really do try to communicate with the living. If they have stories they need to tell and injustices they need to see corrected. If that's true, then I'm listening. And I'll keep listening one autopsy at a time until every story has been told and every truth has been revealed, because in the end, that's what forensic pathology is really about, giving voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves and making sure that their final testimony is heard by those who have the power to seek justice on their behalf. Even when that testimony comes in whispers from the shadows, in tapping sounds from empty walls, in the accumulation of small details that don't quite add up to the obvious conclusion. Especially then.